A little, I would love for it to be easygoing this evening, both because this is a repeat of a time that we've done before. And so I very much welcome people to ask questions or interject or bring up ideas as anything moves you. So the theme for tonight, and if you see any of these like dreaded Zoom gray boxes overlaying my slides, please tell me, because I went through a whole presentation recently with those gray boxes on my quotes and I didn't know. Nobody said it.
Oh.
All right. So this evening is like a brief presentation on the Baha'i faith and humanity's unfolding journey. And I really wanted to look at sort of in general, this whole walk of life that we've been going through as a species and some of the perspectives that the Baha'i faith offers on that journey and some of its more mysterious aspects that have proven challenging in the past. So I hope that in that way, you might get some sense of how the Baha'i faith approaches various subjects. And we do, as we are alive, we deal with a lot of challenging and difficult subjects and issues. And it's interesting because many of them, while being some like problems for the ages, so to speak, they feel so commonplace and so familiar. Like you can talk about God around the dinner table, and yet the whole concept of God remains such a difficult and mysterious subject. And I really love this quote from St. Augustine. He was talking about time, and he said, if you ask me what time is, I do not know. But if you do not ask me, I know exactly what it is. And I kind of feel like we approach a lot of life's mysteries in this way. It's like, as long as we don't dig too deep into it, it feels very familiar and very much well known to us. But if we try to dive in or ask ourselves, what do these things mean? Then we suddenly find that we do not know much about them. This was kind of Plato's whole deal. He would just get into conversations with people and say, well, do you really know what justice is? And then have a whole book trying to get to the bottom of what one word meant. I loved that about his dialogues. And one of those concepts is God. And so a Baha'i perspective on God is that, of course, we do believe God exists, but we also see him as an unknowable essence. Like no human mind will ever wrap itself around the reality of God. God is the pre-eternal, the ancient, the origin of all things. So how can we know anything about him? And so we view that vehicle of that transmission of knowledge as coming from individuals that we term the manifestations of God. And other terms that have been used in the past for these individuals are messengers of God, prophets of God, seers, knowers, individuals who have some special divine insight or connection that sort of gives them a tip on what the bigger life is like, that this worldly life is a part of. And so we see Baha'u'llah as being one of those manifestations of God and the individual who brought the Baha'i faith into being. So Baha'u'llah's writings, his teachings, his life, that is the foundation upon which the Baha'i faith is built. We also view other individuals from the past as being manifestations of God as well. And most of them you would find familiar. Muhammad, Jesus Christ, Moses, the Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster. These are all individuals that we regard as manifestations of God as well. And in their day, each of them brought either a book or a teaching that guided humanity during that period of time in which they appeared. So I'll say a little bit more about them, but these manifestations of God are sort of like, they're the key in this great love story between humanity and God, because they're the link. They're the intercessory bond between us and the unknowable essence. And I wanted to sort of give a story from Baha'i history that illustrates a little bit about the manifestations of God and how they may differ from ordinary human beings who simply have ideas or insights. So this story is about an individual named Janabi Muhammad Qoli Khan Nakhai. It's quite a mouthful, his name. He was an influential and rich local man who believed in Baha'u'llah, and he lived in Khusef, which is a part of Birjan. As a result of his acceptance of the faith, most of his relatives also became Baha'is. This Janab Nakhai went on pilgrimage to Akka to attain the presence of His Holiness Baha'u'llah. Akka in English text is usually called Acre. It's a city in the center of Israel. This is where Baha'u'llah was sent to prison for 40 years of his life, and this building is the prison that he was in when he first arrived in Akka, and he lived in this building without exit from it for several years. So this is where Janab Nakhai was going. On this Janab's first and second visit to Baha'u'llah, he was accompanied by other pilgrims. But when he returned to the pilgrim house, he thought to himself that he had borne all these hardships and difficulties of a long journey that had lasted 6 months, because they had to walk there by foot. They did not have Uber to get from Iran over to Akka. So he had gone here, it took him 6 months, and he was hoping to witness some extraordinary divine events, right? This is a manifestation of God. But he saw in Baha'u'llah a man like others, speaking and giving instructions similar to other men. There is perhaps nothing extraordinary or miraculous here, he thought. This building in the background is the pilgrim house that the Janab would have stayed in at that time. He was immersed in these thoughts when on the third day of his visit, one of the servants came and informed him that Baha'u'llah wanted to see him alone and unaccompanied. He immediately went to the presence of the Blessed Beauty, and as he lifted the curtain and entered his room, he bowed and instantly saw the Blessed Beauty as an incredibly bright and dazzling light. So intense was his experience of this light that he fell to the floor and lost consciousness. All that he recalled is Baha'u'llah saying, Fi amanullah, which means go in God's safekeeping. The servants were able to drag him to the corridor and subsequently brought him to the pilgrim house. He could not eat or sleep for 2 days after that event, and he was conscious of Baha'u'llah's overwhelming presence everywhere. He kept on telling the other pilgrims that he is here with us. His fellow pilgrims got tired of this and asked Abdul Baha for help. Abdul Baha is Baha'u'llah's son, who attended to the pilgrims' needs at that time. After a couple of days, the servant came back again and took this Janab back to Baha'u'llah's presence. When he attained his presence, he poured forth loving kindness and gracious utterances and bade the Janab to be seated. Then Baha'u'llah said, Janab Muhammad Quli Khan, the manifestations of the divine essence are forced to appear in human attire and clothes. If their true being, that which is beyond the veil of concealment, were to be revealed, then all humanity, like your good self, will lose consciousness and swoon away to the realm of the unconscious. Then Baha'u'llah went on, do you know how parrots are taught to speak? The Janab bowed and said, I do not know. Oh, I have to read this from the slide. Baha'u'llah explained, the parrot owners have a parrot within a cage. Then they bring a big mirror in front of the cage, and a man hides himself behind the mirror and starts repeating words and phrases. The parrot sees there in the mirror another parrot identical to itself talking in the cage, and imagines that it is another parrot that is doing the talking. So it too starts mimicking and learns to speak. Now, if the person who is actually behind the mirror were to reveal himself from the start, then the parrot would never learn to speak. It is thus that the manifestations of the divine being should come into the world in human form and attire, so that they will not frighten mankind with their awesome being. And so it's this idea of making the divine reality relatable to our level of understanding, our knowledge, our experience. Basically, they tell these secrets to us in our stories, using our language. And that is this role that the manifestations of God play in guiding humanity. Another way that I look at them as if they are the rays of the sun that link the earth to the light of the sun. If the sun were to try and stand in the presence, if the earth were to try to stand in the presence of the sun, it would just be obliterated instantly and reduced to atoms. But the sun is capable of all of this life-giving power and energy. But in order for the earth to receive that aspect of the sun's light, it actually has to be quite far away. But even though it's far away, it's not remote, because the sun is ever present within the earth in the form of its light and its heat. And in this way, the sun has this intimate connection with the earth through these rays that transit space. And these are like the manifestations of God, communicating all of these beneficial aspects of God's divine reality to our spiritual reality. Baha'u'llah wrote this in a small book he called The Hidden Words, which I found kind of relevant to this story. O Son of Beauty, by my spirit and by my favor, by my mercy and by my beauty, all that I have revealed unto thee with the tongue of power, and have written for thee with the pen of might, hath been in accordance with thy capacity and understanding, not with my state and the melody of my voice. So continuing this analogy then of the sun, one way to look at why the manifestations of God have differed so much throughout history, to the extent that there are arguments between the followers, not only of which one is the right one, but even if they agreed with each other. So in the Quran, for example, Muhammad said, Christ did not die on the cross. And in the Bible, it very clearly says that he died on the cross. So what is the nature of this apparent outward contradiction? So these types of discrepancies, these types of this like friction, you might say, arises not because the truth between them is in conflict, but because the outward appearance of these manifestations is attuned to the historical period in which they come. So it's like the sun remains in the sky and never changes. You know, this earth has been here for 5 billion years, and in all those 5 billion years, the sun now is pretty much the same as the sun was back then. But even though the sun is not changing, our experience of the sun over the course of the day is constantly changing. You know, Marilyn was just saying how hot it was where she's living today, but at 4 a.m. it's not hot at all. So there's two very different experiences of the sun to be had just by waiting for 12 hours. So I kind of illustrated that here with these mirrors, that in the very, very early part of the dawn, before the sun has even gone up above the horizon, if you were to talk to somebody at that time and say, well, what is the sun? And they were to point to the horizon and say, there, that's the sun. Had they never seen the sun before, what understanding and what image of the sun would they have in their mind? It would just be this tiny little ray peeking up over the mountain. But then at a later time in the day, if we had the same conversation, now the sun we're referring to is very different in its appearance. It's very different in its nature. It seems to glow with more brightness and more color. And so it keeps changing from time to time until finally, when the sun rises up above the whole horizon, now you see the full image and shape of the sun. You get an idea of its true intensity. You get some of its full color revealing itself in the canopy of the earth. So even though what we're talking about and the discussion we might be having, we'd be using different terms. We'd be talking about red, we'd be talking about yellow, we'd be talking about white, yet we're describing the exact same reality. It's our experience of that reality which is evolving, not the reality itself. So the Baha'i faith tells this story that God is eternal in his reality, and the manifestations of God are awakening us to this dawning consciousness of the divine being through the sequence of millennia, through these progressive stages, where at each stage we're given a little bit more insight into what that divine reality is about. And one of the new forms of insight that is found in Baha'u'llah's teachings is this picture, is this framing of religious truth as a single unified whole that serves a common purpose. And that all of the differences and the distractions and the friction between these religions, it's a friction in men's understanding of what the manifestations meant by what they said, not a friction in the manifestations' purpose and essence in themselves. So like as representatives of the sun then, we've understood these manifestations of God. Humanity has understood them in very different ways. Like Christians, at least the Western Christians, they've understood Jesus Christ to be God, to be the incarnation of the divine essence. Muslims, let's say Shia Muslims, they view Muhammad to have been a messenger who conveyed the voice of the angel Gabriel in revealing the Quran, but they would never call Muhammad God himself. But there is a synthesis of these two positions. So Baha'u'llah says in the Kitab-i-Iqan, which is a book that means the Book of Certitude, and this is a beautiful exposition of not only the history of religion, but sort of this spiritual framing of this religious truth of the onward march of time and humanity's experience of God. Baha'u'llah said, were any of the all-embracing manifestations of God to declare, I am God, he verily speaketh the truth, and no doubt attacheth thereto. For it hath been repeatedly demonstrated that through their revelation, their attributes and names, the revelation of God, his name and his attributes are made manifest in the world. Basically, there is nothing that we know about God that did not come to us through them. They are his representative. They represent his voice. They represent his will and his intent. And so it's in this way that that if you said to me, Jesus Christ is God, I can agree with that. And if you said to me, Muhammad is not God, I can agree with that as well. It's a dual station that they have to be both part of this earth and representatives of the divine reality. So that, in a really brief summary, is sort of the Baha'i perspective on these individuals, these manifestations of God, and how they have been with us through history. So I kind of just wanted to look for a second and then why has humanity had so much trouble with this, right? Because you would think that if this is like a schoolhouse in which we just keep learning new things with each grade, and everything we learned previously builds into what we learn next. And in fact, we have to have learned what we learned previously in order to fully comprehend what we learn next. Then why would it have evolved into these warring tribes and to all of this conflict between nations? And part of that has to do with the way that we receive this truth. So as an example, if I have a tree in my backyard, and I don't have any tree with red fruit, I have a tree with black fruit. But black fruit wouldn't show up on this slide. And I'm standing there, right? And I'm seeing the tree and having an experience of the tree. I'm actually not experiencing the tree. I'm experiencing the sun by way of the tree, because my eye does not actually stick itself onto the bark of the tree. Very rarely do I have a direct physical experience of the tree. So my experience of the tree is always indirect, and really it's the sun that I'm seeing. It's the sun that I'm relating to. It's just that the light of the sun is taking on a tree shape because of where it's appearing. Similarly, this divine reality is taking on a manifestation shape based on where it's appearing. But when I see this and have this experience, then as a human being, what I do is I construct an idea. It's like the very first thing I do is I say to myself, that's a tree. I think that I know what I'm seeing because I have an idea that recognizes what the light is trying to show me. And that's all fine and good, except from that experience, I abstract a notion. And that notion may or may not have a whole lot to do with the original tree that led to the experience. Yet, it is common practice for us to take that notion as reality and to argue with one another over whether one thing is a tree or another thing is not a tree. So this is kind of like, this is the conundrum that we're in, and why humility and having a humble posture of learning will forever be essential to our development as human beings, because these notions that we get are always just little fragments of the truth. And we need to be discarding them and learning and replacing them with more refined notions continuously and all of the time. Because otherwise, if these notions are led to ossify, if they become a standard practice, or it becomes forbidden to think in any other way, this is when this original harmless truth of the light of the sun reflecting itself from divine reality turns into something that becomes an engine of war and dismay. In another way of looking at this same concept, the same analogy, instead of a tree, what about the holy writings? You know, the author had in their mind some idea they wanted to communicate to us, but they couldn't communicate their whole mind directly. So they communicate through language, but it's my language. It's the language I understand. And how do I know that the way I understand words is the way they meant those words? But when I read that writing and I use that language to understand, I form an idea, and that becomes an opinion. And then I sometimes hold the opinion to be more dear to me than the origin of that opinion. So this is kind of the classic repeating story of mankind's interaction with God. We hear the words, but we end up relying upon our opinions. And this is just the spiritual struggle. This is what we all end up having to deal with all of the time. So the Baha'i faith, in summary, just to give you sort of a 10,000-foot view of it, we do see that all of the world's religions are part of the same unfolding design, like I was just describing. We have no clergy, and so no one person's interpretation has any authority. Baha'u'llah himself and his son did give us some interpretation, but beyond that, no one is held to have any authority in interpreting those writings. So this is quite a difference from past religious approaches. We also think that science and religion serve the same truth. So it's like Chuck was describing this universalism idea. The similar thing here is that we kind of view there being one reality. And there are many different aspects of this reality, but there is a principle of unity that harmonizes it all. And so one of the ways in which the faith seeks to harmonize different aspects of the truth are the scientific and religious aspects of the truth. Science tells us about the world, and religion helps us understand the meaning of the world. We also believe human beings are inherently noble and infinite in their spiritual potential. That's all human beings, regardless of their upbringing or where they come from. And we also think the society we see today, is only at the very beginning of its development. It has a long way to go ahead of it, and it's going to become much more brilliant than some of the things you see today. And another unique aspect of the Baha'i faith is that the religious texts that we have, like that quote I read to you from the Kitab-i-Iqan, these texts were either penned by or personally confirmed by the author. So Baha'u'llah himself gave his seal and signature to these texts, rather than the text forming sometimes centuries after the manifestation of God had already left us. So there's a lot of clarity in that, in being able to trust that the words are original. So with that, I wanted to see if anybody had any thoughts they cared to share, or any points or questions.
Just can I ask a fairly dumb question? Is Baha'u'llah is human, extra human sort of, or actually a spiritual figure?
He is a man, but his soul, we would say, is of a different nature.
Okay.
His soul partakes of an ancient being.
Okay, but is he a living person right now, or is he a spiritual person like Jesus?
He passed away in 1892.
Okay,
so
but
his presence in our life would be spiritual, yes.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, and did he have a country that he lived in, or where was he from?
He was from Iran, what was then the Persian Empire.
Oh, I see. Great,
Yeah.
great. There's a lot of spirituality, I think, in that.
Yeah, it was the Holy Land. That's where he
Yeah.
originated from. Good questions. Thank you. Yeah, I have in one of the other presentations, I actually have a little map that shows where he was from and what his journey was.
I think it would be nice if you had one talk sometime where you just talk about Baha'u'llah and his history and life.
I did do that. I think it was after this talk the last time. But if you go, I have a YouTube channel, and if you go to it, I'll put a link to it in the chat. but let's see what it was called. I think it was called The Life of Baha'u'llah. Here. I mean, always happy to talk about that again. Oh, it's interesting. I don't see one in the list. I guess I don't have it. Well, we will have to do that. Anyone else?
I wondered during your discussion of reality, how much it related to Plato's allegory of the cave, when you were talking about the light and the tree and what is reality.
Yeah, I definitely always think about the allegory of the cave when I'm using that analogy. Yes, it does partly come from that. Yes, this idea that in the cave, we're brought up to see images cast upon the wall by a fire, not knowing that the fire is the origin of those images. And so we take the images to be real. And the philosopher is the one who finally breaks his chains enough to turn around and witness the fire. And he begins to gain a conception of what this mechanism is that leads to all of these shapes that stir up so much emotion and, ruckus among the cave dwellers. But then he goes even further, for he seeks the origin of light itself. So he finds his way out of the cave. And even though the blinding light is so painful that at first he can't tolerate it, he pushes through. And when he comes outside, now he knows too what the cave is and where it sits in the place of the world. Yeah, it's just such a great metaphor. One of my favorites. Yeah, there was a time when in my early 20s when I just had bought this giant book, which was all of the dialogues of Plato. And I just read one dialogue every night. And it was one of the best experiences. If you were to talk to me within that year, you would have heard a lot of stories about Plato and the Greeks, because it was all I was thinking about. All right, well, let's, in the interest of time, continue on. So I talked a bit about God and the manifestations of God, and that was all very big picture and sort of the other side of the equation. So now for the rest of this presentation, I want to talk more about our side of the equation, which is human beings and our development. So Baha'u'llah wrote, "The great being saith, regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. Education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom." This is sort of the essential Baha'i conception of human beings, that human beings not only are created noble, but we are a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. And what is required is education in order to bring those gems forth. So it's not that some people are more virtuous than others, or some have certain natural capacities over others. It's about training and education to discover these gems that lay hidden in the human being's own reality. That in fact, we have an infinitude of potential to reveal the names and attributes of God ourselves, such as his beauty, his power, his majesty, that we can train ourselves and learn and educate ourselves to acquire these virtues and perfections. So this picture in the background is actually the largest diamond mine on the earth. This is the Mir diamond mine in Siberia. I believe it's in Siberia or Minsk or something like that. I didn't know what diamond mines looked like, so I had to look it up, but apparently it turns into a giant hole in the ground. And this is what a diamond looks like when it comes out of the mine at first. So this is the sort of thing you would find in the mine, probably a whole lot dirtier. This has at least been cleaned up. But the reason I show the mine is because even before you begin to search within the mine, the diamonds are there inside of it. So we're not lacking in anything, as I said. But when we bring the diamond out, when we discover the gem, that's not the end either. because at the beginning, the gem simply has the properties of stone. This is like our mortal being. Our mortal being is like the uncut gem. So in it, we see the properties of stone. And then through the process of refinement and education, we reveal the qualities, the spiritual qualities that are hidden and latent within that stone. And these would be qualities like beauty and refinement and perfection. And these become the combination of mortal and ethereal qualities. And this is kind of like what life is about, is for us to take the raw material of our physical cells that have been created by God and put here in this physical form. And our whole task is to bring out from within our being these capacities and potentials. And religion exists to help us do this. It helps because it informs us and guides us towards understanding and knowing how to come into attunement with our spiritual reality. Because otherwise, if a person is left utterly uneducated about their own spiritual reality, we might look to the animals as perfect examples of how we should be in this life. You know, because some of the animals have it really good. I have a quote coming up about the birds, but spiritual teachings teach us that some of the qualities that are best for human beings are not the qualities that are the best for animals. Sacrifice being one of those. Forbearance, patience, altruism, like all of these are qualities that from a purely material perspective could be considered losing in potential. But from a spiritual perspective, these are what lead us to greater states of being. So it's virtue that is going to connect us from one to the next. So speaking of that quote, Abdu'l-Baha said that no wealth, prosperity, comfort, or ease in our material world can equal the wealth of a bird. For it has all the expanse of the fields and mountains for a dwelling place, all the seed and harvests for wealth and sustenance, and all the lands, villages, meadows, pastures, forests, and wilderness for possessions. Now, which is richer, this bird or the wealthiest of men? For no matter how many seeds that bird may gather up or give away, its wealth does not diminish. So the bird is the king. He is the king of wealth. Then it is clear that the honor and exaltation of man cannot reside solely in material delights and earthly benefits. This material felicity is wholly secondary, while the exaltation of man resides primarily in such virtues and attainments as are the adornments of the human reality. And then he gave us a list. He listed out some of these adornments. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but just some of them are things like love of truth under all conditions, discoveries of science, safeguarding the rights of others, education for all races and nations, justice and equity. These are some of the things that ennoble man and that conduce to our well-being and true happiness. I'll just leave this up here for a minute. Sometimes I like to take these quotes and lay them out in a visual form like this to give myself a sense of it, because it's a very long paragraph otherwise.
John, are those all from the same writing, or are they from?
Yes. Yes, these three are all parts of one paragraph.
Wow.
I could look it up to find which book it's from, but
Oh, we can find it.
these are all from the writings of Abdu'l-Baha.
Thank you.
And then I only had one other sort of metaphor to offer. So I found this quote I really liked from Michelangelo. He said, "The greatest artist has no conception which a single block of white marble does not potentially contain within its mass, but only a hand obedient to the mind can penetrate to this image." So to him, it was like if you had a formless block of marble, every single possible shape was hiding in there. And it's the mind of the creator that penetrates that surface and finds whichever one of those shapes it seeks to bring into being. He also said, I saw the angel in the marble, and I carved until I set him free.
That's good.
And I think this is exactly what we are here to do, to see the angel in the marble of our own beings and to carve until we set him free or her free. And thank you very much.
John, can you go back to the previous slide? I was going to send a picture to my daughter.
Sure. You get it, Marjan?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
All right, so the floor is open to whatever other people would like to contribute.
Can I ask what a typical week is like? I mean, you don't have services that you all assemble at, do you?
Every 19 days, we do get together as a community. That's the only sort of prescribed repeating service that we have. But individual Baha'is might often have devotional gatherings, studies. I do a study every Tuesday night, my wife and I and several friends. There's not a whole lot of formality in terms of meetings, but there are many meetings that do happen.
Because they're just more like conversations than meetings in a way, right?
Yeah, well, some of them are very kind of meeting-y.
Really? Okay, well, that's
Yeah.
good. Yeah, but I think there's a real synergy, a real echo with the Unitarian, because there's a respect for the science and respect for the larger world of the living and the physical, and but also with a rich spiritual. And with the Unitarian, one major difference is that the Unitarians don't sort of require a belief in a God or refer to a God, but we would, nonetheless, we do struggle to acknowledge some kind of a great spirit, or the overarching consciousness, or various terms that are sort of just referring to a larger spirit, a larger intellect, a larger presence, the presence of a mind that guides and watches and constructs and that kind of thing. But and participates and can participate, I guess, in what we're doing, and so that a lot of the same thing. But I feel a lot of resonance between, I've seen now this word spelled two different ways, Baha'u'llah, but I just feel a lot of resonance in general with Jesus, as a sort of a second level leader, if you will. And so, but it's fine to have another person like that as a metaphor for somebody that's present to partner with us in a way. And that's, I think it personally very helpful to try and be in dialogue with some kind of higher characters. And I just find that process of dialogue or prayer only rarely feels rooted in real communication. It's usually speaking into an echo chamber or something.
Well, I think you'd also find in the Baha'i writings that Christ-like reality that animates both Jesus Christ and Baha'u'llah is one. It's from a common origin.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't it, I don't know who was a great philosopher who talked about, well, the journey of the hero for one thing, but what's his name? I'm trying to think.
Joseph Campbell?
Joseph Campbell, yeah. He was a great one for picturing spiritual leaders and people that are, you know, struggling to engage or whatever.
Mhm, mhm.
You know, what I would like to see, John,
Mm.
I think it'd be really educative, you know, for me, is a talk on what each of the manifestations of God brought and the development of humankind. For example, what did Abraham bring that humanity needed? And why was that an important step? And what did Moses bring that humanity needed? And why was that an important step? And
Mhm.
on to the other manifestations of God. I would really myself benefit from a talk. And you're so knowledgeable. I think that would be a piece of cake for you.
To see how all the pieces fit together.
Yeah, because all of those leaders, of course, are really very much part of our tradition and part of our thinking,
Mhm,
and with all of the examples that they led,
mhm. Yeah.
struggles that they had, you know. Of course, Noah is getting to be our patron saint these days with all the climate emergencies.
That's funny. I hadn't heard that before.
Baha'i faith is also, Chuck, it's also been involved in the United Nations since the very beginning. And
Right.
because one of the features of the Baha'i faith, one of the main principles is unity of humanity and a peaceful world. Baha'is have been on many committees, and maybe John knows more about that than I do, but it's a very strong commitment to world peace, just like the UUs have.
Mhm.
Right.
Welcome, Wendy. Glad you could join us, even though you're listed as Kendra. Wendy was also a UU.
Oh, okay.
Actually, she was a Universalist Unitarian, so.
She's speaking, but she's muted.
Oh, you're muted, Wendy.
Yeah, yes, that's right. Our UU church was Universalist Unitarian as opposed to Unitarian
Oh,
Universalist.
really? Okay.
But thank you for the welcome, Jan.
What city were you in?
That was in Riverside, California.
Oh, okay, cool, cool, cool. What was there, just what was the sentence that went along with the reversing the order of those words? How did you?
That particular church, that particular UU fellowship originated from a Universalist church,
Oh, okay, yeah.
not from the Unitarian.
That's kind of what I assumed you meant. So that's very interesting. Yeah,
It held on to its historical
that's nice.
beginning.
Well, that's, you know, the community really makes the religion, I swear.
Yeah, that's very true.
I have a question, John.
Sure,
You
James.
showed us a list of blessings or qualities or virtues that men have.
Mhm.
My question is, where did these come from? Are they inherent in our nature? Did we inherit them from our parents through genetics? Or did we evolve them as our spirit evolved and grew? Or, as I think the Baha'is believe, they all came from God.
That's a great question. I like that. So I think that from different things I've read in the Baha'i writings, that these perfections are intrinsic to the nature of the soul. The soul is a perfect divine reality, but it's like a light within a lantern. And our being, our human reality is that lantern. And if the door of the lantern is closed, then none of that perfection of that light can make its way out. So the lantern has to be polished and formed so that it can basically be a fitting receptacle for that light. And as the light begins to shine out from the lantern, that's when these perfections and spiritual qualities begin to manifest. So they are latent, not within our genetics of our physical body. They are latent within our own spiritual reality. And the Baha'i writings actually say that the human soul has the capacity to reflect every single one of the names and attributes of God. Like it's that, to that degree that the soul has capacity. So whatever we discover of the soul's capability in this life, no matter how saintly any one person may become, is still only going to be a sliver of that light, which is potentially ours to develop and discover.
So John, is this what it means that they say that God created human into his image?
Exactly. That's another way to put it.
Yes, I really love that, because so many people feel that, God created man in his image, that people think that God then looks like a man, where really it was the spiritual qualities.
Mm-hmm.
What does the word Baha'i itself mean? Does it have a derivation in a physical or spiritual thing?
Yes, it's actually Baha is an Arabic word that means glory or splendor.
How do you spell that?
Baha.
Okay.
So Baha is glory or splendor, and for a long time it has been known as an attribute of God's. So the word Baha has been associated with God, and in fact, in Arabic versions of the Bible, when it referred to the glory of God, you actually could find the name Baha'u'llah there, because that is what Baha'u'llah means, the glory of God. So glory or splendor is where Baha comes from. And then all of these other words are derivations from it. So Baha'i is like someone who is a follower of the glory. Baha'u'llah is the glory of God. Abdul Baha means the servant of the glory. They're all related words.
Well, thank you. That's deepens my understanding, I think.
Sure. My pleasure.
Now, Abdul Baha is like the servant of the glory or something, did you say?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, anytime you see a name that has Abdul in it, it means the servant of.
Oh.
I'm a little bit curious, John, if you can do it like in the space of like 4 minutes, 5 minutes. I'm curious how you became a Baha'i.
So I grew up a Methodist. My mother was actually quite interested in Unitarian Universalism, and I think for about 2 years she was a member of that church. But in my household, when we were growing up, I was a Methodist Christian, and I do remember enjoying some aspects of Sunday school. But when I reached the age of 14 and she asked me, you're now old enough, do you still want to go to church? I said, hell no, I don't ever want to go there again. Because it was the most boring place in the world to sit and listen to somebody preach, right? I could do the Sunday school. That had some cool stuff going on there, but I did not like the sermons. So I left the religion, and then kind of a little bit soon after became very much an atheist, because it troubled me, the influence I thought I saw religion having on the world. Like, because in the news, you just see the radical elements, right? You see the worst that religion has to offer in the news. And that was kind of what I was basing my impressions on. But by the time I was a teenager, I sort of realized it's presumptuous to claim that God doesn't exist. I mean, knowing an absolute negative like that is kind of philosophically dishonest. So I just became an agnostic. And I was happy in my agnosticism going through life. And then in college, I ran across someone who was a Baha'i. And when I asked him what that was about, and we were talking, I guess I was impressed by the fact that he was very open in his conversation. Like, I'm very used to the religious, I guess what I felt at the time was a closing of the door. Like, there are certain subjects you shouldn't talk about. There are ways of thinking you shouldn't adopt. Like, this is the path. And we talked about time travel, aliens on other planets. Like we were getting really weird. And he was very like willing to consider everything. And he said, well, the writings do say some things that maybe they relate, maybe they don't. And then he would share it with me. So I asked him for a book about the Baha'i faith. And I read this book. I remember reading it over the course of 3 days and really not eating during that whole 3 days. Like I just stayed in my dorm room. I was not going to class. I actually flunked out that whole semester. And I was laying on the floor in the common room, just reading this book. And when I got to the end of the 3 days, then I called my mother and I said, I'm going to become a Baha'i. And she said to me, you should meet some of them first, which was very wise advice. So I said, okay, I'll do that. So I called up the guy who gave me the book and I said, I want to become a Baha'i, but my mother said I should meet some of you first. And so what can we do? He said, all right, I'll set up a meeting. So he set up 2 meetings. One meeting was like a fireside like this one, except it was just me and the speaker. That was it. And my friend and the person who was the family person of the speaker. He was a man from Texas who I met again not too long ago, but it had been a while since I saw him. And I had 3 questions for him. So these were the 3 questions that decided me on whether I wanted to join the faith or not. The first question was, how does a person know that someone is actually a manifestation of God? How do I know that I'm not a manifestation of God? And what was the third one? You know what? I can't believe it, but the third question has left my mind. Do you remember, Nassim? Because you've heard this story before.
Yeah, sorry, I can't think of it right now, but
yeah, anyway, it was something else about like basically framing my mind about who a manifestation of God was and how to identify them. Or no, that was it. How do I know that he's a manifestation of God? Like, what makes a person a manifestation of God? How do I know I'm not one? And how do I know that I can recognize one? And so those are my 3 questions. And he answered those to my satisfaction. So my friend then set another meeting the next day where there was another fireside, and I declared as a Baha'i at that fireside. And that was really it. It was quite a whirlwind tour. But I kind of had a hidden agenda too, because I realized that you're not going to find out the truth of anything until you join it, because that's when people will show you who they really are. So that's what I did, because I could always unjoin anytime. So I just did it to sort of be on the inside. I guess it stuck. It grew on me.
What was the name of the book?
All Things Made New, a book that's out of print now. You may have it.
I do.
I remember reading that book and skipping every quotation that was from Baha'u'llah or Abdul Baha, because their language was so awkward to me that I was just put off by it. So I just skipped it, all of it, throughout the whole book. I just read what John Farabee had to say. Because, I was very anti-religious by the time that I found this book. So the idea of prayer, the idea of saying words like, oh my God, it tasted very strange in my mouth.
Well, God is still the highest order of existence in the Baha'i faith too, though, the word God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, where does a Baha'i come out in terms of God creating the world in 7 days or whatever?
Most of those types of stories from the past, we view them as either symbolic or allegorical.
Yeah, I do too, of course.
They're
Yeah.
teaching lessons.
Sure. But is there an origin process that God went through to create the universe?
As far as we know, there hasn't ever been a cessation of creation. It's just always been going through these cycles of creation and destruction. We don't know when it began. We don't know when it will end.
Yeah, because it probably doesn't have such borders.
Right. And we know there were many, many more manifestations of God before the ones we have on record. And we're told there will be many, many of them to come, that God never leaves humanity alone.
Well, I guess my deep practical thought is that God is is truly a manifestation of our consciousness. And we are, sharing as a planetary population and over vast history, manifestations of our own thinking of what the God might be like. To me, that's the most completely logical idea, because we have never yet met an independent force that's God, but we have all met the manifestation of our thinking. And that's pretty profound over not billions, but tens of thousands of years. We've been talking about God. And so it's there. And so it is manifested in the conceptual, spiritual space of our ability to think, and so that becomes, and you might as well be talking about, I'm going to put garden stones out tomorrow, I'm going to manifest an idea, but we're manifesting in a universal way this gigantic concept of a God. And no wonder we can't quite agree what God's like, because it took about 25 billion of us over the last 10,000 years to decide what it is. And we didn't all talk to each other.
Yeah. Or use the same language.
I mean, I really do hope that we're all of us right, is that there is some kind of an intelligence out there, in a real reality kind of a way, I mean, I just think it's just almost inconceivable there isn't some kind of a manufacturing center of business that's making the universe either on a continuous basis or decided, hey, let's see what this test tube will do.
Right. Right.
For me, that's one of the really interesting things about the Baha'i faith, is the idea that there are two great centers of finding out what the truth is. The scientific method for physical things, like look what we're finding out with the Webb telescope, going back in time. And the other one is the spiritual side. And I grew up as I was in a scientific mode and when I was working. And I was like you, John, I really rejected religion because I saw the rituals as being kind of fake and not really spiritual. So I left the church early as well. But the whole idea that there has to be something, I came to the realization that there has to be something bigger than just the material world, because how do you explain altruism? How do you explain people going into burning buildings and grabbing children before they are toast and things like that? There isn't a logical explanation for that. So that's when I started thinking about a higher being that kind of inspires us to do those kinds of acts. And it's not explainable. You can't quantify it, but I feel
it's not
that
a what?
You can't quantify those things. They're just there. And I think because we can't see God, he's not a being that is visible to us. We have to kind of look for signs that he's around. And I find myself much more open to that now. To if I have a question I'm trying to resolve or a path I'm trying to decide to take or not, I get signs. I really do. I really see, something will pop into my head, or somebody will say something that confirms one way or the other, and I think that's from God. So anyway, just my 2 cents.
Do you remember what that movie was with Jim Carrey, where he takes on the powers of God for a short period of time?
Bruce Almighty.
Yeah, Bruce Almighty. I remember in that movie, he kept asking God questions, and there would always be a sign immediately after they answered the question, and he never recognized what the sign was about. I kind of feel like That's me sometimes.
Yeah, you got to be receptive. And I think that's hard for people like me who are very scientifically oriented. You know, show
Mhm.
me the money, show me the facts.
Yeah,
Right.
I remember as a teenager, the thing that really confused me was how could people say that the people of India were going to hell?
Mm.
And, you know, and it just, and I remember sitting one day and going through the yellow pages and calling all the religions one by one and asking them questions just to find out what the truth was. And I was so confused and so disappointed that there was so much bad talking about other religions. Luckily, the Baha'i faith starts with a B. And I got to the Baha'is and I called them and I went to a fireside with just one person. And we were sitting on cardboard boxes because she was leaving for Africa. And, you know, she packed up everything. And that's where my journey started. And the thing that attracted me was the fact that this has been a progression for humanity and that all of the world has experienced God's revelation, whether in the East or in the West or, well, you know, and so that made sense to me that no one was condemned to hell and that God has spoken to man in so many different ways.
I have a comment.
Yes, Joyce.
I am from a Baptist religion background, and I would like to share the fact that my mother communicated to me that a person that has less education can accept on faith more easily than a person who have pursued scientific background information education because you were taught to question. As an educated person, you question this and you question that. And therefore, my mother said to me that to have the faith, the extent of a mustard seed, is all you need in believing. However, the more scientific pursuit you have in your life, the less you can just believe. You have to have an answer for this. You have to have an answer for that. You have to, and I remember as a student in nursing, going through the statistical class in which you did all of this work. And at the end of it, the only thing you can proclaim is an inference that this might be true.
Right.
Might be true. So going through all of that, I realized there are people in our world that make statements without the knowledge of the responsibility of it. They make all kinds of statements without knowing their information is limited. They need to query it more. There is more information needed before you come to this conclusion, but they come to that conclusion because they don't know that. They don't know that they have limited information. And I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Yeah, a humble mind is a precious thing, but that's not the default. I love how much everybody's contributing. Please, Joyce.
Thank you very much for your presentation tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm glad to see you again. Nassim, Joyce is one of the people that I met at the conference in up north.
Nice. It's always good to see Joyce.
Mhm.
Yes, and our community is going to start a neighborhood gathering, hopefully in the backyard, going over the themes of the conference in a smaller group. So let everybody know, whoever is interested. So we're going to have an hour and a half discussion going over the different themes that we covered at the conference, and then the rest will be socializing.
When are you thinking of doing that?
The second week in September, we are just debating when would be a good time to have it because people are traveling.
Yeah.
School is about to start because the students attended the conference and there was a good number of students who attended from Granite Bay High School, and we want to invite them too. So that would be a great discussion if that group would participate as well. But yeah, we'll definitely keep you all informed.
But we'll be having firesides actually in person probably in not too long. There's a surge going on right now, another surge going on, but I think, you know, with a little bit of time, we'll be doing some firesides in person.
That would be nice.
This was wonderful, and I thank you, Susan, for inviting me, and I thank you, John, for your words. It's just, I've taken notes and have learned so much. I appreciate it very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean.
And I love your questions.
Okay, back to you, Marjan.
Thank you, and